You're going to make mistakes if you're a national security advisor. It's going to happen. And if so, go see the president, admit them, take the consequences, and don't be afraid to offer to resign. I've watched, as many of you have, 40 years of scandals in Washington, Watergates, gates after gates, there are a lot of them. And my impression is that it's rarely the mistake you make that gets you in the trouble. It's if you try to deny it or to cover it up. So if you make mistakes, step up, take the blame, take the consequences. And I would say step up even if it's not your mistake. At 7:05 in the morning, when the chief of staff and the national security advisor and a few others are talking to the president, there's always some bit of bad news that came up overnight, and it's usually the chief of staff or the national security advisor that has to tell the president. And when you start telling, and even if it's not your fault, if you start explaining it, it's very interesting to watch the other people around the desk in the Oval Office, because everybody starts to step backwards. There's bad news on the table, and you don't want the president to think you brought it to them. What the president needs is not people stepping back at that point. The president needs people stepping forward and saying, Mr. President, it's a problem. Here's what we need to do about it. I'll get the process started, and I'll get back to you. That's what the president needs, and that's what the national security advisor needs to do. The most extreme form of the Scowcroft principle of accepting responsibility is something Brent used to say. And I think, and I used to tell the staff, this was the motto of our NSC staff. Every success is the success of the president, and every failure is because the national security advisor and the NSC staff didn't do their job. I actually think that's the right framework for the national security advisor. So how do you succeed as national security advisor if you should have that opportunity to serve? One, channel Brent Scowcroft. Ask, what would Brent have done? That's a good place to start in your analysis. Second, follow the Scowcroft model for the national security advisor job. You'll never do it as well as Brent did, but give it a shot. You will be well advised to try. Fourth, thank your lucky stars that you have a chance to serve our country and its president in this very special role. And finally, hope you have a president to serve who is as noble and principled and extraordinary as George H.W. Bush. Thank you very much. Great. I think I need to say something to wake people up out there. Mac, you're not going to let me off so easily with that presentation, are you?
I'll ask a question, Steve.
Yeah.
How did you keep your demeanor? I don't understand how you did it in some of those meetings where you had such major figures in the room. I could see you were tense sometimes, but you almost never lost your temper or got angry, and you kept equilibrium. Are there some ways that you disciplined yourself?
You are who you are in these jobs. A couple people said, Hadley, you need to get mad a couple times. So, I don't do anger particularly well, but I decided in one case I really needed to get angry. So, I got up my courage and I got angry at somebody. And then I found, once I started pretending like I was angry, I got angry. I don't think it never worked for me. I don't think getting angry actually gets you anywhere. I think that is not the same as not being absolutely clear. But I think true strength not comes from how loud you talk, but how much conviction you put in your voice. And when particularly you can invoke the name of the President of the United States, people will listen. And I don't think you help yourself by getting angry. But, you know, everybody's got their own style in these jobs. All right, here he comes. Mac Deschler is going to lay me bare here.
You called me out, so I'm Mac Dessler, University of Maryland. My big complaint and criticism of your speech is you've taken a lot of the things I was going to say later this morning and said them better. And so I'm now regrouping, trying to figure out exactly what I will say. Serge, let me push you on one thing, which is very interesting. You talk about the question of giving your own policy advice to the president, or Brent giving his own, and doing it sort of privately, sort of at the end of the conversation. That sounds right to me, yet it also, there's a little bit of a, feeling that, you get a pile of memos, it goes to the president and then the national security advisor. Somebody gets to put the piece of paper on the top, and that's the one the president reads, and that's the one nobody else reads, and therefore a sense that maybe that is skewing the process. Maybe it is using the position to disadvantage. I know Cyrus Vance had that feeling about Zbig Brzezinski, and a lot of this I know is manageable by doing all sorts of other things to develop trust. But how do you, if you are giving the private advice afterward, and this is somewhat at variance with what maybe is a consensus, or maybe what the Secretary of State wants to do, how do you avoid making it look, when the Secretary of State learns the President has gone a different direction than what he or she wanted, that you haven't somehow twisted the process?
Yeah, I would say communication and trust. Let me do the trust point first. One of the great things about the second Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, when I was National Security Advisor, is that Bob Gates and I became friends when we both showed up at the White House to serve Henry Kissinger as National Security Advisor in the spring of 1974. I called on behalf of the President, Bob Gates, and asked him if he would be willing to be considered as Secretary of Defense for George W. Bush. Condi I'd known for over 25 years. I had worked for the Vice President for 4 years when he was Secretary of Defense. If you have these long-standing relationships and have trust and confidence of your National Security Council peers, a lot of those kinds of anxieties go away. I remember at a conference where, again, Brent Scowcroft was, at the height of the tension between Zbig Brzezinski and Secretary of State Vance, and someone asked Brent, if you were president, what you would do? And Brent said, I'd fire them both, and I'd start hiring replacements until I found two people who could actually like one another and who could work together. And then I would know I had my National Security Council team. That trust among principals is essential. Second, communication. As I said to you, if I began to lean towards a particular position on an issue, I would make clear to the other National Security principals where my lean was, so they would have an opportunity to rebut it. I didn't like those memos, and I worked for the president who, Henry Kissinger would say the only way Nixon would make a decision is if you gave him a memo, because he didn't like confrontation. The president I served, much more of this was done orally, and after I would have a conversation with the president, got a sense of where he was leaning, I would call the other national security principals, and I'd let them know. So this kind of communication, I think, goes a long way to making sure you're maintaining the confidence of the other national security principals as you serve the president. Sir, I think I got an A on that one.
How about the integration of economic issues, international economic issues? Where in the model do you take into account, it seems to me increasingly that security and economics are closely intertwined?
Yeah, the NSC system is I think, been slow to respond to that. The National Security Act of 1947 says there's only 4 members of the National Security Council: President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and with the head intelligence official and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs providing advice. Most precedents will add other cabinet secretaries, depending on the issue. We established that the Secretary of Treasury was a permanent member of the National Security Council for all issues. And even when we were doing Iraq policy, which is a political military issue pretty far away from Hank Paulson's jurisdiction as Secretary of Treasury, I would try to get Hank to come to the meetings, because precisely because he didn't come out of the political military priesthood, he had a different take on some of these issues, and it was very useful. So I think it is very important to fully integrate the Treasury into the NSC system, because what you want when you come up with a policy set of options for the president is how to use all the various instruments of American influence in a coordinated way to achieve an objective. And one of the things that really has happened over the last 15 years is the emergence of sanctions and other financial tools as instruments of national security and foreign policy. We need to integrate those in with the other more traditional instruments of military power and diplomacy in our national security portfolio.
Thank you
Yes,
for
sir.
coming to speak this morning. Pardon me. So you spoke in your remarks about the president's principles, accepting responsibility, and trying to present all the policy options, and when things go wrong, doing what they can to fix it. But you also spoke about how the president is ultimately the decider. Can you speak a little bit more to the role of the National Security Advisor in helping the president work through decisions, when things don't go as they expected, or choices that they make don't necessarily pan out as they had hoped?
I think one of the hardest things to do is the president makes a decision, and you then try to rally the bureaucracy to implement and execute that decision. That takes a lot of work, and it requires a lot of conviction. And one of the problems is you get so invested in a policy that sometimes you can be the last person to realize the policy is failing. And, there is a tricky balance. I used to say to the NSC staff, people would say, well, what's our plan B? When you have a decision, then what if it doesn't work? What's your plan B? I would always say, plan B is always make plan A work. Because when you're doing hard things, it takes a lot of energy. I mean, especially if you're, as President Bush and his son both did, take the country to war. That is a very tough decision as a commander-in-chief. And everyone in that National Security Council meeting, when you're talking about those issues, is watching the president. And they're asking the question, is the president committed and is the president resolute? And one of the things that President Bush did with connection with the decision he made on the Gulf War, he was absolutely clear that this aggression will not stand. And so it is essential, if you're going to make those hard decisions work, for the president to be resolute and focused and in charge. And you as National Security Advisor have to help that. So on the one hand, you are working, flat out to make plan A work, and plan B is make plan A work. At some point, you need to be able to step back and say, this is not working. And usually the president would help you. I remember in the spring of 2006, when we were pretty bogged down in Iraq, and I went in to see President Bush in the morning, and he had the blue sheet, which is the intelligence summary overnight, and it had the casualty figures. And he looked up and he said, Hadley, this strategy is not working. And I said, you're right, Mr. President, it is not. He said, so go get me a new strategy. And then you've got to both continue to try to make the strategy you're pursuing continue to work as a holding action, and separately run a process to come up with an alternative strategy. And particularly where it's a war that you're losing, to in the midst of that war come up with a new strategy and make it succeed is a real challenge indeed. And that's what President George H.W. Bush did not need to do because his strategy in the Gulf War succeeded brilliantly. But it was what George W. Bush had to do in connection with the surge in Iraq. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Realizing that politics is politics, my question is, how do you protect yourself? Whereby you had told us to never interrupt or interfere between the relationship between the president and his cabinet. And my question is, what about the other way around? Since you're going to be at the focus of everything, you could be a target for everything. So how do you protect yourself?
In Washington, you don't. And you take the hits. And there's no way around it. If the presidents, and it was true for President Bush, for both President Bushes, they understand that the National Security Advisor has no real constituency other than the president. You're the president's agent. And the president, in many ways, will protect you. How does the president protect you? By embracing you. I remember right after I became National Security Advisor, and I was pretty naive about these political things, President George W. Bush said to me, Hadley, I got to go to the helicopter, walk out with me. I said, Mr. President, I'm finished with what I have to tell you unless you have something to tell me. He said, Hadley, you don't get it, do you? And I said, no. He said, you need to be seen walking with the president looking like you're telling me something important, because all the press corps out there, and they need to know you're my guy. So let's go. So the president, one of the things, look, the NSC system is the president's creation. And if it's not working, in the end of the day, the president's going to have to fix it. And the president's got to, in some sense, protect the National Security Advisor by making it clear that the National Security Advisor is speaking not on their own, but for the president. So the president can put the president's big arm around the National Security Advisor and protect him. But it is a political job, and you're going to take your hits. And for me, it came with a failure to catch something that was in a State of the Union address that I should have caught. And it's the old thing. You got to accept responsibility and tell the president and offer to resign and take the abuse you're going to take from the press corps. It's part of the job. What can I tell you? I think we're done. Thank you very much for your time and attention this morning. Thanks for doing this.